Good evening, my name is Dr. Bradshaw, and this film is for the purpose of my students in RAD 2612. This is page 7 of structural analysis. For page 7, the first one at the top of the page is called hip joint width. Hip joint width has 3 measurements. The first one is superior, the second one is axial, and the third one is medial. So the superior goes from the top of the femur head, which would be about right there, to the acetabular cup. So you're just measuring this distance right here. Axial is going to be about at this point, measuring from the femur head to the acetabular cup. So measuring that distance right there. And medial will be one and the same as teardrop distance, but we will measure from the inferior lateral aspect of Kohler's across to femur head right there. So we're measuring again from the inferior lateral aspect of Kohler's teardrop to the inferior medial aspect of the femur head. Now, for this measurement, I tend to think of it as parallel to the film. I also realize that this is a rounded structure right here, and so about the point that it starts to go back around the other way is where I call the lateralmost. So the inferior lateralmost of the Kohler's teardrop would be about right there for me. Now, for the normal ranges, just like we said before, 6 to 11 for teardrop, that's still the number, but there's another comparison that's going on here. For superior, superior usually measures around 4 millimeters. Axial also usually measures 4 millimeters, and you're measuring at a diagonal or at a 45-degree angle across your film, again from femur head to acetabular ridge. And then, of course, medial is femur head to Kohler's teardrop. So superior and axial are usually around 4 millimeters, but more importantly is that they should be equal to each other. So if both of them measure 4, everything is good. If both of them measure 3.5, everything is good. It's when one measures 3 and the other one measures 5 that you've got a problem, okay? Now for medial, just like I said earlier, normal range is 6 to 11 with an average of 9. But more importantly is it should be double whatever the other two measure. So if these both measure 4, then medial should measure 8. If these both measure 3.5, then medial should measure 7.0. Okay? And so we're looking at that. Now, what does it indicate? If you saw an enlargement or on the larger end of the scale for these measurements, then you're thinking of something that has to do with disassociation, such as a slipped epiphysis or a dislocated femur head or a fracture, something such as that. If you see these numbers are smaller than they should be, you're probably looking at something such as a pathology that causes a decreased joint space. And that would be any of your arthritis. That would be anything that is causing a loss of joint space. And so those are the things that you want to think about for hip joint width. The next one on page 7 is called Shenton's line. And Shenton's line is a line that goes along the inferior aspect of the femoral neck across to the superior aspect of the obturator foramen. So again, the inferior aspect of the femoral neck across to the superior aspect of the obturator foramen. So you see how that should form a nice smooth arc across there? A nice smooth arc is considered normal. It's if you had an irregularity or a dislocation, disassociation, that this would not form that arc with the obturator. And so this one is demonstrating normal, and that is what it should look like. So again, that's called Shenton's line. Now, I happen to remember a question one time that the question asked, is it appropriate to see some of the femoral head extending below Shenton's line? I'm not sure where I read that question, but it was one that sort of haunted me because I didn't know the answer. But if you look at this, and when you look in the book, it is understandable and it is acceptable for there to be a small portion of the femur head that will extend below the line, and that's okay. So again, we're using femoral neck to the top of the obturator foramen, and we're looking for a smooth arc. For the last one on page 7, I'm actually going to switch out this film and use one that comes from the lab. Because on this film I do not see enough of the shaft of the femur in order to do that. And so it is called femoral angle. And for femoral angle, and the reason that I didn't use this film for the last two items is because you notice that this is actually, let me move out just a little bit, see if I can move out. Nope, I will have to raise this up. In case I haven't said so before, I really appreciate Brian letting me use his tripod to get this done, and I hope that the rest of the class appreciates it as well. So now I am using this film to do femoral angle, and for femoral angle I am going to draw a line that represents the mid-axis of the femoral neck. Now the femoral neck is this portion, of course, right here, and so the mid-axis is a line that represents the angle or the slope of that femoral neck, and so that looks pretty good to me right there. So I will draw a line right there, and then the second line is through the mid-axis of the shaft portion of the femur, and so I'm going to line that up like that, and I'm looking down here. Let's see, you're not seeing what I'm looking at. I'm looking down here to line up mid-shaft portion of the femur, and I am drawing a line right along right there. Now, when we measure this, we're going to measure the angle that is right here. We're going to measure the angle that is right here. And so I'm going to find my protractor, and I again will put the base of my protractor along one of the lines. I will put the whole of the protractor at the junction of the two lines, and I am measuring from right here all the way to right here. And so this one would measure about 116 degrees. Normal range is 120 to 130. And again, I want to caution you about, sucking in your breath or anything, because this is a phantom view right here. This is not a real person, so they're not measuring normal, but normal range is 120 to 130 degrees. Less than 120 is called coxavera, and greater than 130 is called coxavalga. Layman's terms for less than would be, of course, knock-kneed, and greater than would be bow-legged. We usually don't use those terms in our discussions, but that is the equivalent. And so you're looking at this angle right here. I want to caution you about reading case histories. I was reading recently an article that was describing this angle, and it was also describing the angle formed by the femur